we are so grateful to have you with us today. I wanted to mention this magazine, Reconciliation Healing Hearts, was the inspiration for this particular workshop. We've had a full year of programming surrounding this particular magazine, and I wanted to introduce our guest editor, who is a professor in the theology department as well as a director of the Faith, Peace, and Justice minor, and that's Josh Snyder. So he'll be speaking in a second. I also wanted to point out to you, there are a lot of C21 Center. We are the Church in the 21st Century Center. We more affectionately call it the C21 Center. Those materials are in the center of your tables. Please feel free to take anything and everything of interest for you today. And before we get started, as we do at all C21 Center programs, we'd like to start with an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Loving God, in your very being we discover the essence of relational triune love. Created in your image, empower us today to be people of deeper love, encompassing heart, soul, mind, and strength, both for you and for those around us. Teach us to love those dearest to us, those with whom we are most vulnerable and most guarded. Help us to rebuild trust and authenticity with each other. Enable us to forgive and to ask forgiveness, that we may share in the reconciling work of Jesus. May the impact of hurtful memories wane over time, along with ill will and resentment of others. Grant us deeper friendships with those who can help us be the best version of ourselves. Sharpen our awareness of those who feel unloved. Strengthen our resolve to be agents of hospitality to the lonely, of comfort for the frightened, and mercy for the hurting. Open our hearts to a greater sense of your love for us, a love that is tenacious, patient, and unconditional. Remove the barriers that we have erected in our spirit that block the free flow of your love in our life. Work through our doubt, do not be deceived by our pride, and heal us of our guilt and shame. Loving God, thank you for your grace, and thank you for your love. Amen. And I'll turn it over to Josh Snyder.
Thank you, Lynn. It's great to see all of you out here this afternoon. So excited to have so many students here, as well as faculty, staff, and friends of the C21 Center. So as you know, today is entitled Flourishing Communities in Challenging Times. And really what we are trying to do with this workshop is reflect upon, obviously we know we live in challenging times, whether that be at the global level, the local level, the national level, the interpersonal level, and how can we think about forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation? How do those ideas help to lead to a more authentic way of being in the world? How do they help us to be more flourishing human beings? So hopefully today we're going to have a great opportunity to workshop some of these ideas, see what they're all about. And it's definitely not a lecture, right? Like we're going to be doing the work today of thinking about in our own lives how forgiveness and reconciliation might bear fruit, as well as how we might want to extend that gift to others. So that'll be some of the goals that we're going to be working on for today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our two amazing presenters, and then I'll turn it over to them to lead us in our discussion and workshop for the day. But before we do that, I just want to talk very briefly to kind of set the framework for thinking about these ideas of forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation. Obviously, these are very packed terms, right? They're robust. And what we mean by them might differ greatly from person to person. They might mean very different things to each one of us as we talk about it today. So as we think and reflect on forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation, I want you to think about, what does it mean to you? Is forgiveness about forgetting the past? Is forgiveness about forbearing ill feelings towards another? Is forgiveness more of a decision to move forward in your own life and to not let the past bother you? Is forgiveness something that you grapple with and are just unable to give to others? Right? Likewise, how does that then relate to concepts of justice? When I think of justice when I've been harmed, am I thinking I must hold that person accountable? Must I punish them? Is there a way of thinking more forward-looking towards restorative justice and reconciliation? Again, different thinkers are going to have different ideas on this, and this is what we're invited to reflect more deeply on. and ultimately to really ponder, what do we mean by reconciliation? In its most authentic, robust sense, reconciliation is about restored right relationships with oneself, one's neighbor, God, and all of created reality. But is that really what we're able to achieve in this very fractured, fragmented world in which we live? Sometimes are we only able to just coexist with people who might have harmed us? So, I invite you to think about these questions, how they relate to you in your own life, and, we have a wonderful opportunity to work through some of these for today. So now I'd like to take the time to introduce our two panelists who will be leading us in our workshop, and then I'll actually hand it over to Kate. So Dr. Kate Jackson-Meyer is a research associate at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University and an affiliate of the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics. Her research focuses on the role of forgiveness and restoration in supporting individual and communal flourishing, particularly in the context of moral conflict and tragedy. I'm also very proud to say that Kate is a very dear friend. We work together on our PhDs here at Boston College. Likewise, I hope I can call Steph a friend as well. Dr. Stephanie Edwards is the executive director of the Boston Theological Interreligious Consortium, BTI, as well as teaching in the Faith, Peace, and Justice program here at Boston College. She's a Catholic ethicist and a clinical social worker, practicing diverse service delivery and nonprofit management for over 15 years. Her work entitled In Flesh Counter Memory, A Christian Social Ethic of Trauma, was recently published by Orbis Books, and she'll be presenting her insights as well. And again, I got to work with her on my PhD, so it's wonderful people that we've got that will be leading us. So without further ado, Kate, I'd like to turn it over to you to begin our first segment, which will focus on forgiveness and human flourishing. So Dr. Kate Jackson-Meyer, everyone.
Hello, it's nice to see all of you today. Always nice to be back at Boston College. So as Professor Snyder said, I work at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and there we study flourishing, and we study it in a very holistic way. So here, I know at BC, you guys know a lot about flourishing. That is a topic that comes up a lot here, and we think about that from Aquinas, and that's a very robust view of flourishing that you all have here. But generally, in the well-being literature and public health, when we think about kind of how people are doing, we usually kind of think about it in a pretty simplistic way. So if you were to normally ask somebody in public health how to judge well-being, they would ask questions about happiness. They would ask important questions about mental and physical health. And we ask those questions, but we also ask other questions too. Questions about close social relationships, questions about meaning and purpose, questions about character and virtue. And that sets us apart from other institutions that are looking at this topic, and it makes us very much aligned with the way BC thinks about flourishing. And we do all of this research on flourishing, and after years and years of research, something very fascinating emerged. And that was that when we look at flourishing holistically, so thinking about character, virtue, relationships, forgiveness comes up as an incredibly important piece of flourishing. So studies show, our studies show, other studies show this as well, people who forgive more have lower anxiety and lower depression. People who forgive more score higher on our holistic view of flourishing. And so when we saw this was really incredible, and so we wanted to think more about flourishing and think more about how to promote flourishing via forgiveness. So that's why I'm here today talking to you about forgiveness. So we are all going to face hurts in our life. This is just a part of living. We're going to have hurts in close relationships, in short-term relationships, in familial relationships, work relationships. In any kind of relationship, there's very likely going to be a hurt. And forgiveness is one choice, one option you have for how to deal with that hurt. We define forgiveness, and this very much lines up with Aquinas, as replacing ill will with goodwill towards somebody who has offended you. So you have this ill will towards them, and you're going to replace that with goodwill. And really thinking about that kind of in terms of how Aquinas would think about that. That means, so you have this ill will, and then you have to have goodwill. That means, wanting flourishing for them. That's actually a really high bar, right? So you're going to say, they did this offense. Not only am I going to let go of that, but I'm going to want their flourishing. I'm going to have goodwill towards them. That's how we think of forgiveness. And within that, then, that means that forgiveness is a kind of letting go of that hurt that's going to allow you to have this goodwill. It doesn't mean forgetting. It might be really important to remember. A hurt that happened, it hurts because there's something that you need to know. Maybe there was danger or some break in the relationship, there's some kind of harm, and you need to know that. So you might not want to forget that. It doesn't necessarily mean reconciling. So reconciling a relationship means that the relationship is restored. It comes together. Ideally, as Professor Snyder said, we're all reconciled, right? That's what Jesus wants for us. But in this life, in this world, sometimes reconciliation is not going to be possible. Some relationships are toxic and need boundaries. But that doesn't mean that you can't forgive, because you can still let go of that hurt, and then you can still work on having that goodwill towards that person. So when we think about forgiveness in this way, it opens up kind of possibilities of how we can work on this kind of forgiveness. So there are different kinds of ways of thinking about the process of forgiveness. And there's a scholar, and his name is Everett Worthington, and he started working on forgiveness many years ago in psychology. And he said, I think forgiveness is important, but I don't see a lot of resources for it. And then he had a very dramatic event in his personal life where his mother was murdered. And he was a Christian, and he said, I want to forgive. And he said, I'm a psychologist, and I should know about forgiving. But there are no resources. So I started working on this, and now I'm doubly committed to developing resources to help people forgive. And I think that you might find that that's true too, right? That we know that we should forgive. We know that that's something that we ought to do, but it's really hard to know how to do that. What is that process really like? And so Worthington developed the REACH model of forgiveness, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And he's a pioneer of the psychology of forgiveness, developed this model. It's one of the most highly tested models of forgiveness. And this model helps you to forgive, and it also helps to decrease anxiety and decrease depression. And he developed ways of working through forgiveness through REACH. And then after his years of practice, he said, I'm going to put it together in a do-it-yourself workbook. And so at the program, at the Human Flourishing program, we said, that sounds great. He had a really long workbook, and we said, why don't you make it shorter? So the workbook you have today is the shorter version of the workbook. It should take 2 to 3 hours to complete, and we said we're going to test the workbook. So the Human Flourishing program did a randomized control trial of this workbook that you have right in front of you. And the trial was done in 5 relatively high conflict countries with over 4,500 participants, and it was very cross-cultural, so it was countries like Colombia and South Africa. And the studies showed that people who used this workbook had lower depression and lower anxiety and increased flourishing after using this workbook. So the workbook that we're about to be working on today has been tested and shown to produce all those benefits that we know forgiveness has. All right, so what is this REACH model? So if you turn to page 3 of your workbook, you'll see the acronym for REACH, and this is the model that Worthington developed. So I'm going to think of a hurt. So when we help people through this workbook, we recommend that you start with a small hurt. So even though the randomized trial was done in relatively high conflict countries, so presumably people actually had really kind of extreme hurts that they were working with, we recommend that you start with a small hurt, because we think of forgiveness as a muscle. Forgiveness is a muscle that you're going to build over time. And just like I wouldn't go and run a marathon tomorrow, I'm not going to try to forgive my biggest hurt ever tomorrow. I'm going to start with something small. And so I'm going to give an example, and I invite you to kind of think of something that you might want to forgive. Or maybe you're not ready. Maybe you just want to think of something that you have already forgiven in the past. And a small hurt, something that would be good for this kind of thing, is usually something that it's something that is worth your time to work on, but it's not at a really kind of big level. So often issues with roommates, that's kind of a good one. Those are short-term relationships. Short-term relationships usually are pretty good for this kind of thing. When you have a long-term relationship and you're trying to forgive her, often you can't really pinpoint one thing. You start thinking about a whole bunch of other things, right? Now I'm thinking about my mom, and then it's my childhood. I can't focus in on the one kind of hurt. So usually kind of short-term relationships are good for this kind of thing. A work relationship, somebody, maybe a group project, you had all these great ideas and then somebody just wrote them up as their own, and now you still have to keep working with them in the group, and it's really frustrating. They didn't give you credit for your contribution, and that's affecting your ability to work with them. And so you're going to have to be able to work on this, to let go and do that forgiving process. That kind of thing is the kind of thing that I would recommend thinking about. So I'll give you a second, can kind of think about something. So I'm going to talk about reach, and you can kind of think about that, and I'm going to give an example. So I remember when I was in divinity school, I had a good friend, and we were just getting along so great, everything was going great, and then I was being vulnerable. I told her, something that felt really personable, and then I heard she told it to somebody else, and I was very upset about that. And I'm going to think of that as we talk about reach. So the first step in reach is to recall. And if you go through the workbook, it's going to help you do this in a lot of ways. I'm just kind of giving you the footnotes here. So you recall the hurt, but you recall it in a way where you start to kind of really see the big picture. So at first, when I was working on this hurt with my friend, I was just zoomed in on me and her, and me telling this personal information and her getting it. And it seemed like a closed circuit to me, so I couldn't understand how this information got out there. But if I start to recall the hurt in a kind of bigger way, then I start to kind of zoom out, and now I see her. I see her, and then she's talking to a friend. It's actually the person she's talking to. She knows I'm friends with them. So now I'm kind of trying to see the situation in kind of a bigger way. And then the next step is to empathize. This is the hardest step. This is by far the hardest step, to empathize with the other person. If you can do this step, then this is usually the place where the most transformation happens. But to empathize with the offender, means I like to think of it as seeing them the way God sees them. That does not mean excusing what happened. So it can, absolutely, it's still wrong. But because you can see them the way God sees them, you see them as somebody worthy of dignity and respect. And that can start to thaw your heart a little bit towards them. And then A is altruistic, because forgiveness is an altruistic gift. If any of you thought of a time that you did forgive, then I'm sure you might have also felt that forgiveness is a gift because it's something you freely give, but it's also a gift because when you go through forgiveness, it's you, right? That the gift comes to you. And we have these different forgiveness groups that help people work through the workbook, and one woman said, I want to forgive because not forgiving is becoming part of my identity. She thought, like I think we all do, if I don't forgive, I know how I'm going to get back to that person. Maybe I thought that with my friend. I'm not going to forgive her. That's what I'm going to do to get back. But all that does, that's something that I start to wear then all the time. That's something that's affecting my relationship with my friend too, right? So now I can't, I'm a little bit I'm holding back when I'm talking to her, and I'm doing that with other people too, with other friendships. Now I'm holding back as well. So this thing, I thought I was going to get back at her by holding on to this, but really it's only hurting me and my other relationships. So the gift, it's for them because you freely give it, but it's also for yourself. The C is about making a commitment. So this is something that you have to do often. And then H is holding on to this. There's going to be times where there are going to be things that come up that make you want to not hold on to this. And so this is going to help you. And we're going to be talking about a couple of those soon too. All right, so now that we've kind of thought about that, I want you to turn to page 12, exercise 1.1, and I'm going to give you a moment here to fill that in. And it's to rate your usual use of forgiveness. So at the Human Flourishing Program, we like to measure everything. So you can imagine we were excited about this. It might feel funny, but it's actually a really kind of useful practice. How forgiving are you as a person? So from 1 to 10, go ahead and think about that. All right, and there on the next page, now you're going to think about that hurt. The hurt that you kind of thought about a few minutes ago. And you have a moment here, I'll give you a moment to write there a couple of sentences about it. So when you were reflecting on the hurt, you might have kind of even started to feel the kind of different feelings that come up. And one of Worthington's very helpful work in the work of forgiveness, and that is really a critical part of this workbook, is that he makes a distinction between decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. So you can make a decision to forgive. That is, you really want to forgive. But that doesn't mean that those hard feelings just go away. Because those feelings, right, they are there, they could be really important. You know, that's your body, that's your emotions, that's the Holy Spirit alerting you that something happened, that a harm happened. And you need to process those feelings. So you can still make a decision to forgive and have those hard feelings. In fact, that's often how it is. And then you're going to work through this reach model to process those feelings, to get that information that you need to get from them, and then when you're ready, to move on from those feelings. I find this very helpful because, like thinking about my friend, once I thought I had forgiven, but then I would see her and then all the feelings would come up, and then I would think, oh no, did I not actually forgive? Like, maybe that wasn't really forgiveness that I had. The forgiveness didn't stick, oh no, and then I would be spinning out. But now I realize that I can make a decision to forgive, and I can still have those feelings, and in fact, they're really important. And when I was ready, then I could start to work through to let go of them, because forgiveness is that letting go. And just as a reminder, you know, it's not that reconciling. So in my case, you know, I did want to go on to reconcile with her. And I found for many people, forgiveness is often that first step to reconciliation. It's that first step towards justice. But that's up to you, you know, to figure out that reconciliation part. So now, kind of being aware that we're going to have both this opportunity to make a decision to forgive, but also those feelings of forgiveness. All right, so now I'm going to do an exercise, so if you can stand up, make sure you're safe and comfortable. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, so. All right, so when you're ready, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and put your arms out. All right, I want you to imagine holding on to that hurt and unforgiveness that you wrote about. Right, in your mind, I want you to see what that looks like when you're holding it there in your arms, in your hands. I want you to notice what feelings are stirred up in you when you have that in your arms and in your hands. I want you to think about the ways that you've been holding on to this daily, regularly, in other relationships. And as you have your arms out, I'm sure they're going to start to feel quite heavy. I want you to think about how holding on to this unforgiveness is weighing down your arms. Imagine all the other things you could be doing with your arms, with your emotions, with your heart, if you weren't holding on to this. When you're ready, I'm going to ask you to imagine letting go of that. And when you do, if you can, notice how that feels. Notice what images come up in your mind. So when you're ready, go ahead and let go of that unforgiveness and that hurt. And notice what that's like, how that feels. When you're ready, go ahead and open your eyes. All right, I'm going to invite you to sit down, and there is paper and pencils, and you are going to now draw what that was like, that experience of letting go of that hurt, what that was like. All right, now you're going to share with at your table. If you have a big table, I would recommend you do like 1/2 shares, 4 people, another half shares, and a couple of things before you share. So when we do our forgiveness groups, where we help people to work through the workbook, we never ask people to share the specific hurt. So it's not really, the group process is not about divulging your personal life. It's really about having a conversation, a connection about your forgiveness journey. So when you share in your group, it's really talking about your picture. You show everybody your picture, nothing to be embarrassed about. It's not a art contest or anything. So just sharing your picture, and then talking about what that experience was like to hopefully or not let go or not let go of the hurt, and really kind of talk about it at that level. Maybe what surprised you about that imagery, or what you learned about yourself, anything like that. All right, so you have a few minutes now to share. So when you did the meditation and when you shared with each other, were there any kind of common images or feelings that came up? You could just shout them out.
A lot of like relief.
Re-
Letting go.
Relief, letting go, peace.
A couple of people in our group use like the ocean as an analogy, and I guess that kind of lightness. I guess we felt like lighter after.
Lighter, and it's like the ocean can absorb this kind of thing. It can take it in, the rush of the ocean.
We shared images of like a breeze and like things kind of like blowing away with it.
Yeah, so it's like letting this go. It's this lightness, right? So it can often feel like holding on to this is gonna do something for you, but really holding on to this is usually a kind of heaviness. It's holding us back. And so when we're able to let go, then we can have that experience of lightness. And you know, when you were doing the meditation, we're just early on in the forgiveness journey, right? Maybe you weren't ready to let go. You know, maybe you put your hands down and you were still holding on to that hurt. That could be, and that's important to know where you are in your forgiveness journey, if you're ready or not to let go. That's important information. And so the entire workbook is an opportunity to work through that hurt. And there's opportunities in the workbook to do that exercise in different ways. And then you can kind of see where you're progressing in your forgiveness journey as well. So now I want you to turn to page 14 and 15. So now you've really had an opportunity to think about where you are with that hurt. And you can give yourself a moment to think about whether you're ready to make a decision to forgive or not, and where you think you are on emotionally forgiving that hurt. So it's pages 14 and 15. The whole workbook is this opportunity to work through that reach model, those different steps that I talked about, and to make a decision to forgive, to work through that emotional forgiveness. And at the end of the workbook, you'll have an opportunity to look at those questions again. Thinking about this specific hurt, where you are on your decisional and emotional forgiveness, and also, you know, think about where you are as a forgiving person. So You know, maybe you answered that first question about a forgiving person, you feel really forgiving, but this specific hurt, you're not really moving along in emotional or decisional forgiveness. And then at the end of the workbook, you can see, you know, where are you as a person? Is this not only helping you work on this specific hurt, but is this also kind of helping you to incorporate forgiveness in your life? So, like I said, it's like a muscle or a practice that you can do that's part of your life. There's a flyer here, the Global Forgiveness Movement. That's our program at the Human Flourishing Program where we promote forgiveness. And there's a QR code if you wanted to sign up for one of our forgiveness groups. So that helps people to work through the workbook. So it's very much kind of like what we did today. It meets 3 times, so not a very big time investment on Zoom. And then you can have an opportunity to work through the workbook on your own, and then you come together and talk about that experience. So if you want to sign up for one of our spring groups, you can go ahead and scan that QR code, put in your information, and then somebody will contact you about joining one of our groups. So I just want to close by saying, you know, forgiveness is this a journey. We all have these individual forgiveness journeys, but at the same time, and as you can see when you're sharing, we have very much a collected kind of way of also experiencing hurt and forgiveness. And so we can do that together in solidarity, and we can do that and support one another. And in many cases, you know, forgiveness can be really important to reconcile our relationships, and forgiving is one option that we have for dealing with those hurts. So now I'll invite Steph up to talk to us more about another way of dealing with those hurts and thinking about reconciliation.
Thanks, Kate. Reconciliation is a big word. Who wants to take a stab at telling me where they hear that word most often? When do you hear that word? Do you hear it? Where do you hear it? Why do you think someone's saying it? When do you hear the word reconciliation? I mean, not often these days, but. Church, I heard church. Same. I'm sorry? Oh, confession as the sacrament of reconciliation. Great. Anywhere else where this kind of big word comes up? Yeah. Marriage, yes, very much. So reconciliation has a lot of different definitions, and as we just heard, it has a lot of different applications. One of the things often people think about when they think about how to transform conflict, or when they're asked to actually encounter reconciliation in its literal form, a restoring of right relationship, they often recall a family incident, like between siblings, when your mom goes, you go apologize to your sister right now. You know, and there's this thing about, well, I know it's a good thing, but I don't really want to, and I really don't know how to. I don't know how to own the process of reaching out to someone else and figuring out either how to apologize or how to ask for an apology, right? Oftentimes there's those memes, right, that go around all the time that are like, that's not an apology, right? Something along the lines of like, you just apologized for my feelings and not your actions, right? And that's not what we're talking about, right? Real reconciliation has to be some sort of practice of bringing back together what is broken, okay? And reconciliation is not something that should be taken lightly. I'm also Catholic, and I believe that the reason, one of the many, that we treat it as a sacrament is because it is a holy extension of ourself in vulnerability to another person. And we are asking not just for some sort of nebulous blanket idea of repair, but we're asking for very specific help often, right? Confession, in my experience, done rightly, or in marriage, right, is when you ask someone or you tell someone explicitly, hey, I messed up. And I messed up A, B, and C, and I want to figure out how or if we can move forward, right? And reconciliation in the word itself and in the practice does require you to reach out to another person or people. It's not something, it's a little different in tone to what Kate just talked about with forgiveness. Forgiveness is often, this is the Maya Angelou quote, a gift you give yourself, right? It actually doesn't require the participation of anyone else in your own journey toward forgiveness. But as Kate mentioned, often it does. It motivates us to say, I've worked through the height of my reaction, the height of my hurt, and I do love you. I do love our family. I do love my church, and I want to figure out how to move forward. So I've provided you with a packet here with some tools for how to start this work. I'm a social worker, as was mentioned, and so I approach this not just from a theoretical understanding, but in helping groups and couples and individuals and families work towards this repair. How many of us have had some kind of rupture in our friends, family, or community or church group over the last, let's call it, since the pandemic? I have, right? How many of us have felt like we wanted to figure out a better way forward? How many of us have felt like that feels impossible? Right? So what I want to point out to you on that first page of that packet are questions I want you to ask yourself about your readiness and the situation's readiness to enter into active reconciliation. And this is really hard and honest work you have to do with yourself. Because as much as we may want to repair our relationship with our sibling, with our parent, with our church, we may not be ready, and the other partner may not be ready to enter into a reconciliation process, right? Because remember, this is a different activity than our work on forgiveness. So on this page, you'll see 4 general categories of questions that we work with in facilitation or mediation around conflict. So the first is what I just said, readiness. What steps can I take to honestly assess the situation and the people for their readiness for reconciliation? What does that mean? First and foremost, can I ensure that if we enter a process, everyone is safe, number 1, and supported? Why might that be the first question I ask about doing reconciliation work? What do you think? Why would I point out safe and supported? Yeah.
If people aren't safe, they're not going to open up and share their emotions.
Yeah, so if someone doesn't have a feeling of safety, they're not going to, number 1, be honest. And second, when we think about reconciliation, Kate brought up the example of the founder of the REACH model. That is a quite extreme situation of harm that he went through with the killing of his mother. Can he ensure safety if he wished to reconcile with that perpetrator, right? There is a real risk to encountering reconciliation. It's not always that extreme. It can be an emotional risk, but it's still a risk. And you want to make sure that not just you march in and say, I am ready, let's heal, baby. No, you want to have an assessment of each partner or person feeling like they have their own resources for safety and support. The next part is what we call like ninja black belt level work. And this comes a lot out of our individual forgiveness processes. Can I de-center myself in the conflict? What does that mean? We just worked on it a little bit in the REACH model. What might you think about if you're trying to de-center?
You empathize with the other person?
Yeah. You empathize with the other person. And you also, in that first sentence, will see, and we'll practice this today, can I participate in non-ego-centered listening? What does that mean? How do you often listen to another person if you're in class? Yeah.
Well, it was more to the first
Sure.
half. Is that okay? Okay. I was just gonna say, I feel like typically you're like listening while you're like almost preparing what you're gonna say next.
1,000%.
Yeah.
You're listening, when you're practicing what we often do, especially in class, right, or in work situations, you're listening and you're like, okay, she's setting me up for my next point, and I'm gonna slam it home, right? You're not actually listening to what they're trying to express to you, right? You're using your listening moment as self-referential, not other-referential, right? And being really honest with yourself about if you're ready to listen to the other person without that type of self-referential instinct is a really hard thing you have to ask yourself. The next one is something you're probably a little bit more familiar with, which is boundary practice. What does it mean to have a sense of your boundaries? When somebody says that to you, what does it usually indicate? Any thoughts? We love this word on TikTok psych right now. Yes, a boundary is how you take care of yourself, right? And they need to be very literal. A boundary isn't something amorphous, like I want you to respect me. That's great, we do, we really want that. But it's if you use harmful words to describe me, I'm going to have to leave the process, because that is an expression of you not respecting me, right? So boundaries, when you're entering reconciliation, are often things you really need to sit down with yourself and try to illuminate, and then when you start the process, ask someone if they can agree to those boundaries, and that you can agree to theirs, right? It's a two-way street. And finally, this is kind of the one that encapsulates everything, it's self-awareness. Am I entering reconciliation for reasons that are bounded with my ideas of empathy and desire for right relationship? Or am I pursuing reconciliation because I've been told it's the right thing to do, and Father so-and-so said I had to? Right? We're Catholic. Sometimes we're like, okay, I'll go do it, or else I feel bad. That's actually not healthy practice of reconciliation. It can be a way to motivate starting this inquiry into whether or not reconciliation is appropriate. But if you rush towards reconciling a difficult situation because you feel it is mandatory or because you feel obligated, then you're not actually entering into it with an ability to listen to the reality of the situation. So I want you to flip over, and you'll see in color a conflict style assessment. And I want you to take the next 5-ish minutes to fill this out by instinct. So I want you to read the prompt and rate it, and don't think too hard about it. So I discuss issues with others and try to find solutions that meet everyone's needs. Knee-jerk rating of myself. So go through each of these. You'll flip to the back and it'll ask you to do, I'm sorry, some very simple addition. And we're gonna talk a little bit about our conflict styles, how we enter reconciliation. Remember to practice non-judgment. Really do it based on instinct. Just 1, just 4, whatever feels right. This isn't a static judgment on who you are, just an assessment. So while you're finishing, this is a very basic assessment of the way in which you are constitutionally entering a reconciliation moment. So we often think about conflict, and specifically in reconciliation moments, as something that is bad. Conflict as morally bad. And I want to push back on that to simply say that conflict is human. Like Kate said, we're going to go through life and experience hurt, but we're also just going to experience moments of difference. Conflict is not something that on its face is good or bad. It's something that you are just going to have to encounter being alive in the world. And understanding the very basics about your attitude or your position towards that conflict, that moment of difference, is one of those ways we can work through what we just talked about on the front sheet of discerning our way into preparedness for reconciliation. So I'm gonna call myself out. Who's a shark with me? Is it just me? No. Dang, yo, you guys are so good at this. I'm a shark, all the way down. Eldest daughter, type A. I will run your life for you. Here's a binder. Like, I am that girl. Like, I want Cynthia to heal so bad. Cynthia's a buddy of mine. But I want her to heal so bad that I'm gonna enter that environment and be like, I got this. Let's go. That's it. Come on, girl, right? That's inappropriate. That's not helpful. But it's really helpful for me to understand that about myself. What are the things I need to do to practice actually my least scored area, avoidance? Hey, guess what? Not everything's a fight. Not everything is for you. Not everything is your battle, right? And there are ways, right? These are not good or bad ways of entering conflict. They just are ways. And I've also provided in this packet more nuanced conflict styles measures that you can pursue on your own. They're free online, and there are some that require the purchase of large books. But these are tools to say, can I understand myself well enough so when I go into reconciliation, I don't default into the way in which I think a conflict should be handled based on my style, and instead be aware of the way I enter conflict and then navigate it more thoughtfully. A way we do this work, first and foremost, that I already talked about, is through listening. Now, this can seem so basic. However, I was in the car driving down here today and listening. My husband's an NPR journalist, so of course doing my duty and listening to the radio. And one of our administration in the political sphere came on the radio, and I turned it off because I can't listen right now to that person who is incredibly opposite of me in almost every way. That means, on its face, that I would absolutely not be ready to enter a conversation with someone seeking healing across a political divide at this moment. Now, I have to work not to judge myself for that, because while we measure these things about ourselves, they're not static categories. These are ways in which we need to check in with ourselves on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis and say, am I now ready to do that work? And can I do it well? Can I keep everyone safe and supported and boundaried and well-loved throughout that process, such that we actually do end in a more reconciled space than we started, rather than feeling forced, because it's a good thing, to do this work and then create more harm or simply end up where we started. So I want you guys to look on the page that's titled Sacred Listening. So this is a modified version of a full-length training that the nonprofit called Resetting the Table offers to groups and universities. And it's mostly used in interreligious contexts. Those are the ones that I mostly work in. And it is a process of how to listen to one another and actually to get out of your own way when listening. So the first tenet is to follow meaning. So this is a one-on-one practice, and when you are the listener, you are going to not just actively listen in the sense that you're nodding or saying yes, you're actually looking for the signposts of meaning that they're saying out loud. You are trying to identify moments that they express emotion or words or phrases that they repeat. And you're also going to offer follow-up questions, but only for clarification, not for could you say more about, oh, that's interesting, my mom said, no. You are simply asking, you used the word charge. What does that word mean? I don't understand when you used it. And that's active listening to understand, to follow their meaning. And then this exercise, after you have listened, is going to ask you to demonstrate your understanding. So without elaboration and without any additions, you are going to repeat back to that person what they told you. After you repeat back, and this is the challenge of this exercise, there is no discussion, there is no further questioning. The practice of listening was the beginning and end of the exercise. Now, this is very similar to what Kate talked about with practicing forgiveness. We are practicing listening because it is a muscle. You have to listen so intently and so purposefully such that you can actually express someone's story back to them without embellishment or your own bias. And then the real challenge is you don't get to say anything about it. You don't get to have an opinion about it. You don't get to have a debate about it. You don't get to extend it. That was it. And it was a practice of, for example, in my example of listening to the radio, I would have had to listen to that and repeat the exact words that I deeply disagree with back to that person and ask, did I get that right? And they say yes, or they offer one clarification, and then you say, thank you. And that's it. And that practice of empathy, you may notice if someone's expressing something challenging to you, your body may activate, you may get a little sweaty, you may get a little nervous, but the idea here is that you're stretching that muscle to be able to listen to someone that you deeply disagree with and try to form a relationship, because reconciliation is about relationship repair, that can eventually have actual conversation about the thing that you disagree about, right? But we can't have a conversation until we can listen to one another. So I want you to look at the exercise on the next page. And we're just gonna have, you have groups of like 4-ish at each table, but you can just break off in 1-to-1 dyads, 2 people. And there is an exact process I want you to go through. So this is also comes out of a broadly Jewish organization, and so they also ritualize the practice, much like other world religions. And so we open and close with a prayer. I've offered you a simple one here from the Franciscan Action Network. And then skip 2, because I'm just having you dyad out. And then you're going to share on the topic, which is in number 4, about your conflict style. And then once you have shared, demonstrated understanding, shared, demonstrated understanding, then you'll close again with that simple prayer. Questions? Okay. Have fun. All right, I hate to do this, but for the sake of time, I gotta call us back. And I did get asked a really great question for a practical example, because I mentioned, right, that you do this as potentially a first step or a step you repeat prior to having further conversations about a conflict. So a lot of my work is in interreligious spaces, and since October 7th, that has been really difficult. And the prior relationships that a lot of the schools and congregations that I work with really went either under strain or ruptured. And a way to enter reconciliation across such a large divide of not only a geopolitical conflict, not only the extreme loss of life and suffering, but also a loss of what people thought was a mutual understanding of each other here in the States. And so a congregation of Reformed Jews that I work with and the ISBCC, the largest mosque in New England, which is in Roxbury, decided to enter into a form of reconciliation with each other, but they knew they had to start here. They needed to simply be able to sit across from someone who experienced the events of October 7th and the war in Gaza differently than they did, and literally be able to listen, repeat back, an end. And that is that building of muscle, right? When your community or yourself have undergone extreme harm, to listen to someone who sits in a group that you either thought or now think is opposed to you is incredibly hard work. And it takes a lot of time and compassion and patience. And so deep or sacred listening, depending on the tradition you're trained in, asks you to simply do just that. Not at the sake of further harming yourself or the other, but in a safe and supported environment where you can practice rebuilding that muscle of empathy, rebuilding that muscle of being able to say, I hear your story and can reiterate it back to you without my own judgment or embellishment. And after about a year, those groups were able to work together now in a neutral community-based project. Now, are things perfect? No. Did everyone participate? No. But what happened was, by and large, these communities that had had relationship prior were able to reform a new one and move forward with their shared interest in building a better and safer and more just Boston, right? So this can happen at that scale. It can happen with roommates. I have had students here at BC use it on their significant others to try to get them to say what they actually mean. But it is something you can practice either on the large or the small scale. At the end of the packet, you'll find another deep listening survey, kind of like what you did for your conflict style, to kind of assess how you listen and where you're at with that skill right now. And something I want to leave you with, because I am a social worker and I am somebody who is really deeply involved in the psychology side of all of this, is that I want you to understand that as much as these hurts can develop into harms that we need to treat with more tools from psychology and from medicine, a lot of times in our current parlance, we tend to over-pathologize our hurt and over-pathologize or medicalize the ways we need to heal. Bless you. And I want you to understand that there are tools in our tradition and there are tools in conflict transformation that you can start exploring now in tandem with those other conversations, such that you do not feel like all of these hurts, harms, conflicts, and questions are living alone in your psychology. They are also a part of our social fabric and a part of our faith, and we do have tools that can move us forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Snyder, who's going to have time for questions for himself,
For you
me,
guys.
oh, not him, me and Kate.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards and Dr. Jackson-Meyer, for an amazing workshop and presentation, for the invitation to begin to reflect on where we need to start in forgiveness and how we might begin perhaps a process of reconciliation. So we have a few moments if anyone has questions for either Dr. Edwards or Dr. Jackson-Meyer. So if you have a question, you can either run up, there's a mic over there, you can scream it out real loud and we'll have someone answer you.
Okay, you briefly discussed how to go about when you feel like you're almost like asking for an apology, or like you're asked, like you feel like you're the one wronged, or like you have hurt feelings, but the person who did the wrongdoing isn't the one addressing it, like you're going to the person to address it. And I feel like sometimes when you are trying to ask somebody for an apology, it feels almost like disingenuous, because you're like, okay, well, like I just asked you to say sorry and you just said sorry. So suggestions.
Great, super question, thank you. So, the way that we're talking about forgiveness, the way the workbook is leading you through forgiveness, it's entirely an individual process. So this is you deciding that you are ready to let go of that hurt. There's nothing that the other person is going to do that is going to tip you over in this. This is just you are ready to do that on your own. There's nothing in the workbook that's going to encourage you to go and talk to that person. There's nothing where you get to where you're going to tell them that you forgave them. You can absolutely do all of those things, but this is just a personal thing. At first I thought that was a weakness of this model, but now I really see it as a strength, because this is something that you can do on your own, and then you're going to decide what to do. It's certainly the case that many times we feel like we can't forgive until something has been met, some kind of expectations have been met, like an apology, or Worthington talks about an injustice gap. So there's, an injustice has been done, it needs to be made up. Now there's a gap there, and you need a certain amount of that gap to be filled before you can forgive. But this model is saying you can do that. You can forgive without any of those things. You can let go, and in fact, forgiving in this way, then, in my experience, can really empower you to do the other thing. So it's actually, once you've let go, then you can go and pursue justice. Then you can go ask for that apology if you think that's what's needed. But it's really only after the letting go that it becomes clear, oftentimes, kind of what's needed next.
We talk a lot about, and you'll see this on that first page for preparation, like, am I ready to do this? The last thing is, am I ready for this to fail? Am I ready for them to come up short? Because a question students often have when I teach this here at BC is, I want to do this, but the other person is completely unwilling, or the other party is completely unwilling. And I'm like, well, then that's it. There you go. Because reconciliation is not a practice you can force. If you are truly repairing right relationship, that's a different ball game than just coexistence with boundaries or tolerance. That's why we have workplace protections. That's why we have anti-discrimination laws. That's tolerance. When you're talking about reconciliation, that's next level work. And it does require a level, doesn't have to be your level, but a level of willingness and preparation from the other person or persons. And for you, the most critical is, can I let go of an expectation of resolution? This is particularly painful, but also important in families, especially across generational lines. I'm going to still have a relationship with my mother. Can I accept that she is not going to meet the level of reconciliation that I would desire for us? And can I let go and forgive and empathize and move forward, right? They go hand in hand.
Yes, one more question.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what reconciliation looks like. Like, it's one thing if it's interpersonal between two people, but you were mentioning October 7th. So we're talking about two possibly more very diverse groups, some at different levels of openness, some with different experiences of trauma, directly and indirectly. So I'm curious, what does that look like when you have within groups, some who are ready, some who are not, some who are indifferent? Like, I guess I'm just curious what that looks like for those communities.
So what we've done is, it's like a coalition of the willing. Truly, it's what are the members of these groups that are ready to enter with good faith, an assumption of goodwill, it's a big one, into this process with the other. And that when you enter reconciliation, it's quite often a facilitator will say it's very important that we don't put down like you are doing reconciliation better than someone else. It's simply a process into which you enter as you are and when you are ready. And when you're working with very diverse groups of people, right? Those congregations I was talking about are not monoliths, right? Those are incredibly diverse groups of people that fall on all different shades of every category. And so when I've been asked to enter such spaces, we do so with those within the group who are ready and willing to engage. And the hope then is they bring that experience back to the other members who were not ready at that time to pursue it, and they can reflect back their experience, and hopefully we can create a positive one. Now that also goes back to our boundaries conversation. When you're doing this work in high tension groups and highly traumatized groups, you have to be holding space very particularly and very explicitly. So what is this space for? It is for a process of listening. What is it not? Group therapy. What is it for? It is for engagement, literally encounter. I've never met you, let's meet. It's not for solving the histories of our peoples, right? So forming, you'll see on the back of your listening sheet some of the class covenants I use here at BC and with other groups. And those are agreements that I ask all people to enter into such that we do understand what we're up to during that time and what we're not up to.
Excellent. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Please, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn momentarily, just to give us some final wrap-up. And then I'm sure if you have maybe an additional question, we could be around afterwards if you'd like to keep the conversation going. But Lynn, thank you so much for gathering us today.
No, thank you, Josh. Please let us thank Josh and Kate and Steph for a wonderful workshop.